The city slept like a beast with one eye open. Even the wind that ran among the towers and weather vanes seemed to hold its breath, as if it had learned the lesson every man in King's Landing learned in time. Sound was a summons. In the Red Keep, torchlight ran along wet stone and the sea gnawed at its cliffs. In Eddard Stark's chamber, a half-burnt candle pooled across parchment as his hand moved with a steadiness that did not belong to a hunted man. He had written and sealed 3 letters before the wax on the 4th began to harden in a crimson disk stamped by the dire wolf of Winterfell. In the margin of the desk lay a wrapped bundle of coin, a small file, 2 plain knives, and the dagger whose shadow had almost killed his son. Honor was a mountain in him, immovable and white with ice, but it had learned paths. "I know," he said quietly, before the girl had time to speak from the dark place by the door. Arya always found doors. She had that in her blood, ways and edgelight. "We leave tonight. I can get the swords." Her voice was a scratch of thread pulled through leather. "You will get your sister," Ned answered, and watched her face tighten like a fist, then open with the ache of it. "And the bundle by the hearth. Wise as a wolf, quick as a cat." The words were poor coin for what he had already asked of her. He had kept her too long in a den where men smiled with their mouths and not their eyes. It had taken Renly's green cloak brushing him in the corridor and the short breath of the man's warning. "You will lose if you try to do this by the book," for Ned to turn his thoughts against their long habit. He had not believed Renly would stand for Stannis, or Stannis for Renly, and he trusted neither. But he did trust the shape of the snare he smelled closing around him. He saw Littlefinger's patience in the small things, Varys's soft hands on threads, the way Lannister gold dulled a man's conscience without his knowing it. He saw his girls. The city would collapse into knives when Robert's wine ran out in his body. In the last letter, his hand had not trembled as he wrote it. He named the first true king in a generation and then folded the truth between wax and warden's seal. Stannis would not charm the small folk nor the Southron lords, but Stannis would not waste justice for love. If the realm must be asked to swallow a bitter draught, he could see no other surgeon to hold the cup. Arya slid away. The candle tottered and he cupped it and set it right. Sansa would not come easily, and that cut another way. He had seen the new shape of her mouth when Joffrey spoke and when singers sang of silently weeping maidens. That mouth had not been Catelyn's. It had been a soft, southern thing. He remembered that Catelyn had been soft once too, before duty taught her the weight of the north. At the 3rd bell, Varys came like a shadow that smelled faintly of cinnamon. He had a boat beneath the cliffs and 5 men who would row and never speak of it because their mothers lived in Flea Bottom and had been promised bread. He had a word too, soft as breath, which fell into Ned's hand like a stone. The city watch would not dance for him in the morning, no matter what Littlefinger had purred in his ear. Gold went where gold led. Ned had never trusted gold. "You will not be hand for long," Varys said and blinked small eyes. "Lord Stark, men will call what you do tonight many names. Treason will be among them. So will sense," Ned replied, "and perhaps mercy." He wore leather and quiet rings of mail, and he took only what he would not mind losing. A wolf head clasp, a letter to Stannis for a ship out of the city, a memory of the cold of Winterfell that would not melt even in this southern heat. When he left the chamber, he did not look back. They threaded stair and corridor like a seam through cloth. Sansa stood in the dark of her own chambers with Septa Mordane's hands fluttering, falcons without the air. "Father?" she said, and in that word he heard Winterfell again. The small feet on the stone, the braided hair, the courtyards and the shapes of snow. "We are leaving." He kept his voice even. "Do not argue with me." "I won't," she said at once, too quickly. "Joff." The name was a hook. He saw it catch in her. "Must we now?" "Now," Ned said, and it was his father's voice. The voice that had sent him south once when everything in him would have sworn to winter. He took her hand. She was taller now, he noticed without wanting to. Arya was a shadow on the far side of the hall, a little blade floating behind the Septa's fluttering skirts. The cliffs smelled of wet stone and the weed the sea leaves like hair. The boat was a blot of tar, breathing. They climbed down the slick steps with hands out to the rock, and the surf took their knees and then gave them back. There was a green lamp fixed to the prow, a watchman's trick, and the oarsmen bent their backs without words. Ned's knee remembered Jaime's steel when he settled. It had been a poor thing to let hot blood run where planning should sit. He had learned and been taught the same lesson thrice, and the city was no place in which to keep learning. They slipped out under the black ribs of the cliff while the keep's red banners drooped like tongues asleep. Out beyond the mouth of the cove, the bay was black silk lapped by moonlight. A gull cried, and Ned heard it as a northern thing for a moment. Then the boat came around a hull like a house, and a voice hissed rope, and the lantern was doused. Wind took them. The last thing Ned saw of the Red Keep was a single tower, thin and patient as a needle, watching them leave. They sailed by night and hid by day. Men who live by the sea know how to be small when they must. They rested in salt marsh and under jutting headlands. They listened for oars that did not belong, and Varys's men made signs invisible to anyone not brought up to read them. Sansa was sick twice and then lay with her eyes shut and the smell of the tar and the fish in her hair. Arya sat with her feet swinging and learned the names of knots. "Why not fight them?" she asked once, on a morning shivering with fog. "We could." "Not here," Ned said. "Not to win anything worth the losing." At White Harbor, the Manderley banners came out so quickly it seemed the wind had made them. Lord Wyman's fat face was a winter hearth, comfortable, large, and as dangerous as a fire untended. He listened, his rings clicking like the small counting of coin. He gave them meat and bread and a chamber that did not smell of the sea. His men went to the docks without being told and saw to a ship north while others walked to the granaries and had quiet words with men in wool hoods. White Harbor arranged itself around House Stark the way it had always done when called upon, until the city seemed again like a place the North practiced wearing to remind itself it could. "I will write to Manderley again," Ned said to Catelyn when he lay in the bed that had known both of them in younger years. "For ships. For," he stopped. He did not sleep. The old gods did not favor beds for counsel. They preferred water and wind and trees that had learned to stand still. "You will write more than letters," Catelyn answered. "You will blow horns." They rode for Winterfell with the sea salt still on their clothes. The air began to smell clean in the way that bites. The first time they passed a heart tree and he saw the red leaves and the carved face's old sadness, Ned felt like a man who has been under water too long and finds air. He knelt with his daughters, and Arya watched the way he knelt and did as he did, fierce in silence. Sansa's lips moved. He did not ask what she said. At Winterfell, ravens woke and slept with messages on their legs until the rookery hummed like a forge. Men came, pulling winter in behind them. Umbers with laughter like drumbeats and shoulders like gates. Karstarks with eyes that looked past. Tall hearts out of the cold green. Manderley riders with fish on their surcoats and straight spines. Hornwoods with the smell of bear. And there was Roose Bolton, quiet as frost, his pale gaze like milk skimmed of cream. Lord Serwyn. Lady Meage Mormont, short as a sword and twice as useful. Men who had no names in the songs and wore holes in their boots waiting in the yard got bread and were told where to stand. The gods would whispered around its pool, and Ned took counsel not only with men but with his father's bones and the water's skin. He had let himself be guided by habit in a city that had none, had been noble in a place that had invented rules to be unmade. He would not do so again. He traced the map after the talk and saw the currents in rivers, the bend of roads, but also the stubbornness of stone. King's Landing was a cage for a wolf. He had left it, but the lion's den remained. He gathered the lords in the great hall, beneath banners that had not been taken down for 100 winters. The girls were there on the side benches, wrapped in furs, and Robb was straight in his chair as if being straight produced strength. Bran watched from a wheelchair with his jaw set. Rickon slept with his mouth open like a little fish and Shaggy Dog curled like a shadow at his feet. The direwolves moved like pieces of weather. "You know what was done in the south," Ned said, and it took nothing from him to speak the names. "You know what was almost done to my son, and who held the knife in all but name. You know where the power behind the Boy King sits and where it was suckled. It is not the gold on the boy's head that must be broken. It is the cliff of it. Tywin Lannister will not leave the West while he believes his house sits on something no man can take. So long as the rock stands for him like a mountain in his back, he will set the realm on fire and roast meat on the pyre. Burn the harbor, he will build another. Break a son, he will breed more. But crack his house at its root. Make him afraid for his seat. The hall had that silence which means breath is being taken for a shout. But the shout did not come from all throats. Some men blinked. Roose tilted his head a fraction. The rock is a fortress, Manderly said carefully, though hunger shone in his eyes when he imagined ships. So is winter, Ned replied. And we do not plead with it. We prepare and we endure and we use what it brings. I will not climb the red keep with a ladder of dead men. I will not trust gold cloaks to remember their oaths when their paymaster smiles. I will not play songs for courtiers and hope that truth charms them. We will take the West if we can, or we will make Tywin's house a place he cannot sleep in, and we will use the fear of it to cut his strength from him everywhere else. How? The Grachan's laugh was the asking of a blow. Will you call the crabs to bring it down? Will Wyman's ships put their masts through stone? By making him fight where he does not want to, Ned said. By turning his son's strengths to snares, and his pride to a leash. He traced roads in the air. The Riverlands bled already. That could not be ignored. He had letters from Riverrun, Edmure's impatience stamped between each line and Brynden Tully's silences more telling than any cry. Jaime Lannister moved with a firebright company, quick and sure, while Tywin gathered slow and heavy, eating what he needed and calling it a levy. The River Lords tore at their beards and bent their necks because they had to, but they would break if left. Ned did not intend to leave them. We go south, he said. But we do not go to the city. We cross the neck, make terms with Lord Frey to cross the Green Fork because it is a bridge and bridges are what he loves to sell. We relieve Riverrun. If we can take Jaime Lannister we do, but I will not risk all for one golden head. From Riverrun we do what no one expects and go west, leaving Tywin to gnash his teeth at Harrenhal while we set our own teeth in Lannisport's throat. He turned to Theon Greyjoy then, and he saw the boy's chin come up as if he had felt something lay on his shoulders. You grew among men who live by the sea, Ned said. Our friends in White Harbor can bring ships south. Fair Isle sits like a door before Lannisport's face. There are ways to come by night, and there are always men in harbors who will sleep through anything if you give them the right dream. We will not sack Lannisport. We will not shame ourselves in this, but we will take it and hold it with the weight of the North. With the city in our hands and the sea gate barred, we will put a cord across the lion's chest. He will feel it tighten each time he breathes. Theon's eyes shone with the old salt. If you need ships, my lord, I will not ask your father, Ned said, and watched the flare in him. I will not give him that weapon to hold against the North, but I will send you, not to beg, but to choose. If Balon Greyjoy wishes a world in which Lannisters are kings and the North is a feast, he will show it. If he wishes the realm broken so that he might play Reaver in its ribs, he will show that as well. You will show me who you are when you return. Catelyn looked at him once across the hall, and he saw grief and agreement sit side by side in her. They moved with the speed of a plan that must not be allowed to cool. Ser Roderick set the watch. Maester Luwin's hands were black with ravens. Howland Reed came to Moat Cailin with his men so silent they seemed to have grown from the water. The neck breathed mist. Could have swallowed an army like a pond swallows a stone if it chose. The Crannogmen guided the long gray columns across the causeways with poles that went down until they found bottom. In the morning the reeds were hung with frost like jewelry. Arya rode between her father and the men she liked to watch. Daisy Mormont riding like a storm, the great John chuckling to himself, Jory's absence cutting even here, Ser Wylis Manderly with his oath like a table he bore of his own will. On the third day out of Moat Cailin, a fox watched them from a tussock and then ran. A red thing for the red folk to come, one of the Crannogmen muttered. Hush, frog, said his cousin, and it was done. They came to the twins under a sky like old pewter. Lord Walder needed his chair carried through the hall because spite would not move his legs as spite moved the rest of him. He smelled of stale time. He wanted hostages and names and music for his table and a promise he could display. He wanted to be the man a great story could not avoid mentioning, even if the mention was a bruise. Catelyn sat with him and used the kindness that makes a man feel it is his idea. The offer did not smell of insult. It smelled of work. Olivar Frye would squire at Winterfell. A Frye daughter, whichever would have some joy from it, would be a handmaid to Lady Sansa, who would learn to see the worth in a girl who had not heard singers singing of the shape of her eyes. A fosterling would be raised in the shadow of the heart tree and learn what snow is for, and no bed would be promised where the body in it would not be old enough to choose. Walder counted it all and found that he could sell the bridge and not lose face. He named prices for food and passage. Maester Luwin recorded them. When the North's army moved across the Green Fork, the twin stones felt for a moment like they had been made for something other than counting years. The Riverlands steamed with the breath of suffering. The news came in a widow's shawl. Jaime Lannister had taken the Golden Tooth and ridden along the Red Fork with his bright company and his easy grin, scattering small levies like birds. Tywin moved slower and heavier. A great boar shouldering aside woodland, destined for a pit and insisting all the while that no one had dug it. They came down on burned farms and bleeding towns, and the North's men began to hear what southern pain sounds like up close. They did not like it. They had a simplicity that did not understand why a man would strike a child because her father would not give up his cart. At Riverrun, the Tully banners looked tired in the rain. Brynden Tully stood on the walls with a hard face and eyes that did not sleep, and Edmure rode out too often and returned bent by his horse's effort. The Mallisters came with their gull and their sure seat on the sea. The Pipers and the Vancess with cheeks red from wind and wine and worry. "He's quick," the Blackfish said at the council table, pointing at the line that showed Jaime's raids. "He likes how quick he is. We can make that into a little trap and feed him cheese." They fed him night instead. Ned parceled out the North with a patience he did not call cleverness. The Great John sat on a ford. Roose Bolton moved like fog up a river road and waited where men would come because they thought there was nothing there. Robb took a screen of horsemen and lit fires where men would see them and rubbed out tracks where men would expect them and sent gray wind into the night. The wolf returned with blood on his mouth and a look that said more. The first time Grey Wind brought them to a hollow with a knot of Lannister scouts sleeping like boys in a woodsman's tale. Arya watched her brother's hand lift and fall and the men move as one body. She saw the line between a thought and its shape in the world. Her father watched too. The way Robb's jaw set was not Eddard's, but it belonged to his blood. At the Whispering Wood, the trees said what leaves say to one another when rain comes, and the ground drank sound. Jaime heard, perhaps what he always heard, a song for himself. He had left his flank open because he trusted speed and his sword and the idea that men would not dare. Ned did not dare. He arranged so that daring was not required. Men slid around him in the dark and clamped down with hands on mouths and steel on throats. Grey wind went through the horses like a winter gust. When Jaime realized where the iron ring had settled, he smiled once. That flash, but it did not reach his eyes. Robb took him in the circle of men and Grey Wind's low growl, and the Kingslayer laughed like a man who has bitten his lip too hard. He gave up his sword with the grace of a man accustomed to being watched. "We will not hang him," Ned said quietly into the growl, and the Greyjohn's howl of disappointment went up like a contest with the wolf. "We will feed him good bread, and the chains will be clean, and he will sleep among men who remember what he is and who we are." He looked at Jaime. "Do not mistake courtesy for weakness." "I never do," said Jaime, and his eyes were like a place where a fire had been. Riverrun breathed. Edmure strutted and was told to sit and heal, and the Blackfish was given a map and a nod and a piece of the West to break. But when men around the table ached toward King's Landing, when they wanted to pour their sudden advantage down the throat of the city and watch it choke, Ned shook his head. "You will not find justice there," he said. "You will find walls and boys and grins behind sleeves. We take what is needed." He moved pieces on the map. "From here we go west. Wyman's ships will be at Seaguard. Fair Isle will have fishermen who need coin. We make Lannisport a house for the wolf. They moved like a thought no one wanted to think. Men assumed the North would roar down the King's Road, throw its weight at the gates of King's Landing, and stage a song. But the North was heavier, older than song. It went along the Red Fork and the Tumblestone, gathering news and sifting it like meal. The Mallisters took men by water under a night without a moon and were gone before anyone could imagine they had been. Seaguard's longshoremen were quiet men who understood nets. When Wyman's ships came with their white masts and their deep hoo, alas, they carried soldiers whose boots smelled of bear fat and peat, not perfume. Lannisport lay in a bowl of hills that turned toward the sea like a congregation. The rock itself rose like a lion at rest, its mane a tumble of stone, its face grim and magnificent, its eyes the windows of lords who had never thought their view would be on anyone's terms but their own. The harbor was thick with ships in yellow and red, the water slick with tar, the air full of voices and gulls and counting. By day it looked like a place no man could rob without being seen. By night it became something else. Men who work docks learned the shapes of shadow. The night they came in, the wind died as if they had bribed it. Wylus Manderly stood in the prow with his cloak pinned back and his face set to a seriousness that would have made his father proud. A fisherman from Case stood at his elbow and whispered the names of currents. Theon Greyjoy held a rope in his hands and watched the dark seam between water and stone as if it were a word he could almost say. He looked older lit by that kind of night. He had returned from Pike with salt in his hair and something bruised in his mouth. He had stood before Balon Greyjoy in a hall that smelled of old iron and heard the man laugh at him in a voice like rust. "They will come north," Theon had told Ned. "He will not help you. He will not help anyone. He will take while the realm looks away." He had put something down on the rush-strewn floor then. "If you have ever thought of me as a son, do not send me back. I had thought of you so until you asked me to be your father for the first time," Ned said. He did not touch the boy's shoulder, because the boy would grow up only if not handled like a child. "Then see this done, and let the sea teach you the rest." They came under the western sea gate as the tide turned, in the cold hour before dawn when men who have cheated sleep since boyhood are at their weakest. The Lannister galleys slept with their hulls kissing in rows. Manderly's men moved along them like an idea. Lines were cut, grapnels thrown, mouths stopped. Throats opened when a shout swelled too high to be trusted. A deckhand woke to see a Northman's eyes and a hand at his mouth and knew nothing more of mornings. On the quay, a bell began and died and did not sound again. Ned heard the small clash of understanding in the city as he came down the plank. He had come with the first wave, because there is a thing that happens to an army when its lord stands in front of it and the danger is the first thing he touches. The city guards came in 2s and 10s, looking over their shoulders. They were good men who wanted to be alive at nightfall and had wives who used their names as if they were important. When they saw the wolves and the bear and the fish banners, they did not run. They set themselves with clumsy bravery, and it was a new hurt to fend them. "Hold!" Ned called, and the word seemed to be caught by the masts and sent back thinner but more numerous. "Who yields is taken mercifully, who runs is not chased. There will be no raping, no stealing, no burning. Any man of mine who thinks this is his right is a dead man whose family eats free in Winterfell, because I will not starve the innocent for a wolf's mistake." They took the harbor in a quilt of small fights and sudden surrenders. Men in palisade guardhouses put their pikes down because they had counted their families. The Manderly banners went up, and the ships under Lannister pennons were turned in their berths like cattle in a pen. Dawn came like old tin. The city behind the harbor watched with its mouth small and its eyes wide. The rock itself reclined and blinked, and the lions carved on its gate did not move. The siege began. From the landward side, the rock was earth and stone shaped by men who had spent centuries learning what shapes defeat. It was a mountain taught to act like a keep. The sea lapped at caves at its base, but these were doors made for the sea to enter and leave, not for men. The lions were carved in a hall one might stroll in as a guest but never as a conqueror. Ned had not come to batter his skull against it. He came to wait and make waiting into something sharp. He sent riders along the sea road and beyond it to the Bane Fort and the crag. He sent the Blackfish to treat with houses who had never loved the Lannister way of counting. He sent word to the Rain's old neighbors that he knew what songs were about and what stones still knew of fire. Under banners of truce, he sent Tyrion Lannister bread baked in a square mold and a jar of honey from Winterfell and a letter that said nothing and everything. I will not hang your brother unless you make me. The letter went in with a boy with ears too big and came back with a fine hand written beneath his. Do not count on me to be the worst of my house. That effort is crowded. From the city's high levels, Lannisport women leaned from windows and watched Northmen drill and felt in their bones the strange truth that men at war can sometimes be less dangerous than men drunk with peace. Ned did not flood the markets and he did not starve them. He set a price for bread and enforced it with cool men with lists, as if he had always been their bailiff. He made it so that the Lannister name did not bake bread here that a mother could afford. Instead, the wolf taught the West what fairness costs. Tywin Lannister came to the sea road with a host like weather. He had thought the North would throw itself at King's Landing and be broken on cobbles and treachery. He did not think of his own back wall being pulled out like a drawer. When the news of Lannisport fell upon him, he did not rage. That is a lie told about him because men love to imagine that those they fear are also slaves to the same silliness. He folded his anger like a garment and set it aside. He sent men riding. He summoned houses with words that weighed more than their histories. He had letters carried with an urgency that paid the full measure of his respect for Ned Stark with coin that was also a threat. He came to the edge of the city and set his banners in careful rows. He did not rush at the harbor. He had assaulted cities before. He skin-sewed patience to the muscle of his will. He sent his brother to speak, because Kevin's mouth was not a weapon but a tool, and it made the shape of sense. Ned watched Kevin come with the calm attention of a carpenter selecting wood. You sit in our city, Kevin said after courtesy. It sits in my care, Ned said. It will be the better for it when you carry it back to your kitchens. House Lannister is not a kitchen. Every house is, Ned said, and there was a small smile like a scar in him suddenly. It holds food or it falls down. Kevin exhaled through his nose. You cannot take the rock. You know that. I can end the West for you, Ned replied. I can make it a place Tywin's grandchildren never understand, because songs will not remember when the counting changed. I can do it without hamstringing a horse or burning a field. I can do it by asking questions at markets and paying fairly and reminding people what you forgot to remind them about yourselves. Or we can trade. I have ships at your harbor mouth. You have Sansa among those who thought to teach her what a queen learns. You have Jaime. I have your son. Your son, Kevin corrected, and for the first time his mouth changed. Your other son is here. He gestured, and a rider came forward, and Theon Greyjoy wore the wolf as if it had been painted under his skin. Ned felt something knot in him again. Theon had returned from the sea and come to ground where he had chosen to set his feet. Tell Tywin, Ned said quietly, that this is not King's Landing, where truths are asked to bend because someone's pride will snap if they do not. He gives me back my daughter and swears by what he still has of worth that she will not be bent to songs nor made into an object. He gives up the boy he put on the throne to the judgment of the realm. Stannis, as his law, will be asked to judge, not for my sake, not for the sake of any flag, but because we either are a realm where law is iron or we are a place children cannot be raised. He calls his banners home and feeds his people and waits. He lifted his eyes to the rock. Or else he goes down in history as the lord whose great house learned the meaning of the word siege from a wolf who could count. Cersei paced in a chamber high and golden in the rock and wore her anger like perfume. She was a lioness born too far from the hunt and had found her hunting in beds and in boys' ears. She spoke to Tyrion with the clean hatred siblings learn when one of them has something the other can neither buy nor crush. He means to shame us, she said. He means to make you choose, Tyrion replied calmly, and when she laughed, it had a thread in it that sounded as if it might break. Tyrion's mind was a room with many doors. He opened them and walked through and came back with things he had seen for later. He did not love his father and his father did not love him. But there is a way a man will defend the house that despises him because he knows its rooms better than the men who pretend they own them. When Tywin sent for him, it was not to be mocked. "What would you do?" Tywin asked without looking up from a letter that did not deserve his eyes and had them anyway because he gave his attention as part of his warfare. "I would ask whether the law is a meal you mean to serve again in this house," Tyrion said, and when Tywin looked up then it was like a door quietly shutting. "If it is, the boy must go. Give Sansa back and watch the songs about mercy find you. Let the wolf serve his own pride to his own hearth. There are ways to starve a siege without starving the people you will need when it breaks. And send me to the city when this is over, because I will not be content to be the clever shadow you dismiss in private." Tywin's mouth did not change, but he was a man who listened to arguments even when he could not be seen to have done so. He moved pieces. He had Ser Adam Marbrand cut lanes through his own levees so that food could be carried in along goat tracks no one who did not live here since a boy would know. He had every man who attempted theft from the city scourged, whether he wore gold or red or none. He had Cersei locked in a chamber with his silence until she stopped shouting and tasted it and understood he would use her to count his coin if he had to. He summoned Kevin and said, "We will keep the boy here, not for long." Then he said to the messenger, "Ride to King's Landing. Give this to Baelish. Whisper to Varys that I will remember a thing." He wrote to Pycelle, who had once been a man behind ideas and had long since become a man behind windows. He did not write to the queen because that had never been useful. Sansa came down the road to the siege not on a horse but in a carriage with curtains that could be pinned back. Her face was pale in a way that had no softness, and her hands lay in her lap like quiet birds. When the carriage door opened and she saw her father, the mask slipped and the child was there again. It suffocated the men around them and made them look away for fear of remembering anything not hard and clean. "Father," she breathed, and he gathered her as if his arms could be a place she could live again and not have to know the shape of a crown and a boy's cruelty. He had dealt for her dignity with enemies. He would deal for her childhood with himself as the debtor. Arya came like running. They collided with a hug that turned into a fall and then into laughter that made men smile who had not smiled in months. On a night when the sea made a deep sound like a bear sleeping, a dozen crannogmen went out from the harbor mouth in small boats with the tide. Theon went with them and knew the way the water felt when it moved under him because his body remembered it from Pike. The caves at the base of the rock breathed out and in like a house that sleeps. The men waited on black water and watched wet stone. They had found a place where the sea wore the cliff like teeth, where in low water a man could reach up and feel the roof of the world above him. In the hour when the tide swallowed its spit and took breath, a hole opened where water had cut and cut again for centuries, a throat where smugglers had whispered once and then been forgotten. The crannogmen put their boats forward like dancers. They went from black into a deeper black and then into a kind of thin gray that was not the sky but a light trapped in stone. Ropes, hooks, the careful breath between touches. Theon climbed last and felt stone under his palms and the old fury he had once called home not in him. Above, the rock's innards muffled the world. They moved through a throat of stone that had been half-choked with masonry in an age when a man had wanted to be sure and then died without telling his heirs which crack he had trusted. Howland Reed's men could find cracks with the pads of their fingers. They did. They came up into a vault that smelled of old copper and damp. They listened. Far off, boots. Cough, lonely. They moved like rain at night. Tyrion Lannister sat with a candle guttering and read a ledger he had already memorized. He had sent men to count grain because counting grain is how men eat. He had argued with a mason and a priest and Cersei. He had found a drawer in the rock's belly that the family had not opened since a previous Lannister had feared a river more than a wolf. The drawer contained a story no one wanted to read. The ways in and ways out that desperate men leave behind them and then pretend are not there because they make their pride itch. When the first crannogman slid out of the darkness, Tyrion did not reach for a sword. He raised a hand and let the little man see his palm. Then he said, "Not here." He led them 3 corners down and into a chamber where the walls had sweated since Aegon was a boy. He handed them a cloth-wrapped shape. "If you mean to take the gate," he said softly. The counterweight chains are old. They like to sing when they are woken. Oil them first." The crannogman looked at him for a long time and then nodded once, like a frog in thought. Theon gave the dwarf a look in which hurt and thanks had decided to sit down together and share a drink. "Why?" Theon asked. "Because," Tyrion said, and he looked tired, "I know the cost of pride, and if you intend to be in my house for any length of time, I prefer you do it without knocking more pieces off the walls than are strictly necessary." They swam back out before the tide could return and chew the boats into pulp. That night, the gates at the sea mouth answered to chains that had been smoothed with oil, and the gatehouse guards, expecting only waves, heard nothing new. When the Northmen surged in by water and from a postern door that had opened once in a winter of hunger generations ago and had been bricked up poorly under a lazy foreman, the fighting in the rock was like a fever taking a body unprepared. No fire. Ned had forbade it. It was close work, iron and muscle and the wet grunt of men. The Lannister guards were not cowards. A man does not stay a guard in a rock for generations if he fears darkness. They made of each corridor a little world. In a stairwell, the Grachan's laugh sounded like someone breaking a barrel. In a gallery hung with old tapestries where lions hunted stags, the tapestries took new stains. In a chapel with lion-faced saints, Roose Bolton's men were colder than the stone, and the candles died of themselves. Cersei screamed her fury at a door that would not open to it. "Father!" she cried, and the word was finally used for something older and simpler than her plots. Tywin stood in a chamber where his ancestors had measured height on a jam where boys' names had been scratched and then polished out. He put his hands on the table and did not move. When he moved at last, it was to draw a letter with a steady hand. He did not surrender. He did not know the shape of that word for himself. But he understood that to keep a house is to know when the house must be made to seem to bend. He ordered the Rock's women and children gathered in the great hall and placed the household guard around them. He sent for Ned Stark by sending Tyrion with a small flag of truce and a brain like a candle in a windproof glass. They met in a chamber that had once held miners' maps, now browned and curled at the edges. There were 2 chairs. They took them. The men at their backs stood like furniture that might kill. "Your daughter is safe," Ned said without preface. "She will stay so. Your son eats. He will continue to. You have taken my city," Tywin said, and his voice was the voice of a man refusing to say a word he had not taught himself. "You hold my gate. I hold your people's trust for a week," Ned said, "and then I will be measured and forgotten. Men remember the mills that grind their bread, not the men who sharpen the stones." He leaned forward, his knee and old ache in him. "Give up the boy in the city. The law requires it. I will keep Sansa in the north until the truth is spoken with a voice none may gainsay. The small folk will be fed. Your daughter will not dictate the realm." Tywin's eyes did something very small. "And if I do not? Then we occupy without cruelty until cruelty comes to us," Ned said. "Then we make the West into a place where men say, 'It was better for us when the lion ruled,' for the wolf counts but does not laugh. We can do that. I do not wish to, but I will." "And the Kingslayer?" "Lives," Ned said, and did not move his eyes from Tywin's. "He will be exchanged when the shape of the realm is decided by law." The lion looked upon the wolf and understood that sometimes teeth need not be bared to be sharp. Tywin had been tyrant and steward and slayer of songs. He had not often met a man who would not be moved by wealth or by the idea of glory or by fear of what men would say. He had met a man who would move only for the law and his own stern sense of mercy. It was an alien currency. Tywin was rich. He placed his ring on the table like a coin. "I will write to the city," he said. He felt the letter already, weighted by his hand. "I will cede the boy to the law, and I will take what follows. My daughter will go to Casterly Rock. You will leave my city the way a surgeon leaves a wound. Clean. If you or your wolves touch so much as a barmaid to frighten her, I will do things that will make the line of your house a short song." Ned nodded once. "There will be no touching. There is a way the land changes when a letter runs before men like wind before rain." In the city, Joffrey screamed like a child because he was won. Cersei tore the room with her hands and found it did not bleed as it should and cursed the shape of a father's power that did not look like her sort of cruelty. Pycelle fussed, and Varys smiled his soft smile and moved men the way he moved pieces of silk on a table. Littlefinger's eyes went far away for a minute as if the future had called him by a false name and he had answered. The city watch went on watching the city. In the Stormlands, Stannis read the letter and the corner of his mouth moved in what men who did not love him would call a grimace and men who did would recognize as a prayer come back to him with a piece of meat still on the bone. Renly smiled and preened for the Tyrells and calculated how to be the sun while his brother was a law about rain. Ravens flew. The sea rolled. The siege at Casterly Rock became something else. A negotiation held in wind and hunger and the clink of armor and the weighing of words by men who had thou. GHT they could spend them as they pleased. In the west, small folk learned the limits of wolves and the limits of lions. Men who had been kicked in the market by a guard under a golden lion learned to use the price of bread set by a man with gray in his beard. Men who had never been thanked for anything learned that sometimes a woman with a dire wolf stitched on her cloak would say thank you for bringing water. There are revolutions made with fire and those made with ledgers. The latter last longer. When the boy king was given over to the law and Stannis's dark banners took him like a stone from a crooked wall and placed him before a bench and spoke with the voice of a realm that remembered what words meant. The rock sighed. It did not fall. It would not. But it knew the weight of itself for the first time in generations. Pride is heavy. Ned left Lannisport as he had promised. Not with pomp but with a count of loaves and a promise that the roads left behind would be watched by men who would take bribes from no one in the colors of anyone. He left garrisons not in the houses that had been quickest to bend their knees but in those slow to. Men watched him go and did not call him Lord. They called him something else they did not have a name for, and years later their grandchildren would call it by his name because that is what men do to things they cannot easily explain. Jaime Lannister rode out under guard, unconquered and bound. His hair a gold apple that had fallen and not yet rotted. He smiled at Sansa once without cruelty and at Arya not at all. The girls walked beside the column sometimes and sometimes rode, and when the wind came from the west it smelled of old money and new rain. Theon Greyjoy walked a little ahead of himself. He carried the sea in his bones and looked north when he slept as if his body could already see the Iron Men coming the year he had promised to stop them with words and had failed. He had not failed yet. He dreamed of a hall that did not laugh when he spoke. At Riverrun they held a feast for the sake of the men who were alive to eat. Catelyn pressed her forehead to Ned's. They breathed each other. The Blackfish raised his cup and did not smile out of habit. Edmure smiled enough for 3 men and then remembered he had been wounded and groaned so that women might see his courage. Robb sat with his direwolf at his knees, a line drawn on his face by something no water would wash off. You marched west, he said to his father afterward, in a small courtyard where moss grew old and the stars waited for men to finish talking. When I thought you would go for the city. There is more than one city, Ned replied. He put a hand on Robb's shoulder and felt the new iron in it. Win the ground that holds a man's heart, not the one that holds his chair. Will they call us traitors? Robb asked. They will call us what suits them, Ned said, and the corner of his mouth made that scar-like smile. There will be time yet for names. There will be winter first. They rode north in a season that seemed to remember how to be honest. Along the road, the Freys did not smile, but they did not unsay their word. Roose Bolton rode silent as an old promise, and his men's horses made no more noise than water. He watched the way the North moved together and measured it, as men with certain minds measure anything that might one day be a patient. The Great John rode with a new tale coiling in him like a spring. Men asked to hear it. He said, We took the lion's den and left it in order. We taught the bastards what bread is. They laughed and called for more ale, and the truth in it sat on the table like a knife abandoned in sunlight. At Winterfell, Snow took back the courtyards like a king who had never left. The heart tree had not moved and did not need to. Ned stood before the face and let the red leaves brush his cheek. Sansa knelt and said fewer words than she would once have said. and Arya did not kneel but stood with her head up and her hands open as if she had a taste for whatever the old gods would throw. Bran watched from his chair and saw more than any of them would ever see, and Rickon learned the shape of laughter again by chasing a wolf with snowballs. Catelyn held Ned's hand beneath the cold, and he squeezed once and did not apologize for all he had been and all he had not. Ravens came like black snow bringing news that was not all fire. Stannis had taken the city without wildfire, because he had taken the boy with law, and men who might once have burned for glory instead counted what it cost to light that many candles. Renly made a show of being a rose and a sun and then became a lord again, and the world lived. Tywin Lannister dug himself into his rock and measured the years until he might move again. He found that he had time, which was a new and dangerous thing for him. He set about making of that time a blade. Ned went to the words that had always held him. Winter was coming. He felt it not as a threat but as the old rhythm that would not be denied. He sent men to man the wall in number greater than some years because he knew that being right in the south meant nothing if the north failed to remember itself. He wrote to Stannis with a hand that had learned to be clear. He wrote to Wyman and to Blackwood and even to men whose eyes he did not like to meet. He kept Jaime Lannister alive and under guard and forbade men the small cruelties that make themselves into habits and then into a man's nature. In the mornings he walked the yard with Ser Roderick, who scolded boys the way a cask scolds a tapping, noisily, without malice. In the afternoons he sat with his girls and taught Sansa the names of trees and taught Arya to say please when asking for meat at table even if the man was slow. Some nights he dreamed of the rock sea caves and woke with the sound of water in his ears. Some nights he dreamed of a boy made king by lies and woke with the sound of a northern wind and thanked it for its honesty. The song that spread, if it can be called a song, did not speak of ladders up city walls or dragons over river mouths. It was not much sung at all. It was told in markets by men weighing fish and in inns by men who wanted their own purses kept on their own belts and by women who had found the price of flour had held for a season. It was a story about a lord who had marched not to the place where glory is gathered but to the place where pride keeps watch, and who had knocked, and then set to counting the plates, then left, having tidied the kitchen. It was an odd tale, and the South did not love it, but the North and the West remembered it when winter showed its teeth and men had to choose whether to be wolves or to try to be lions in snow. Years later, when the first true snows came down the King's Road and stuck and did not melt, Ned stood in the Godswood with his sons and daughters and listened to the water talk beneath ice. He had a scar on his leg that would always ache before storms, and a scar in him where the city had been. He had taught the realm a thing he thought without word for it, and the realm had taught him more. He had taken a den and left it standing, had sent a boy to judgment, had kept a promise to himself in a foreign place, and then brought his children home to a truth older than crowns. "Winter is coming," he said, not as a warning but as a piece of breath, something you say to measure yourself. Robb nodded. Arya grinned at the cold like a conspirator. Sansa pulled her cloak close and did not shiver. Bran looked past them all. Rickon threw himself on his back and made a wolf in the snow with the sweep of his arms, and Shaggy Dog put a black paw in the middle of it with what you might, if you did not know better, call a sense of humor. Above the rock, gulls wheeled on winds that had learned the new ways. In Lannisport, the price of flour stayed fair through a winter. Men said it was because someone had written the figure down when it had first been set, and then made sure the ink did not run when it rained. They did not sing about it. They fed their children. In King's Landing, the law had been taken down and put back up, true by true. It would lean again in time. Such things always do. But for a while men pointed at it when they argued and then stopped arguing sooner. On a day crisp as glass, a raven came to Winterfell with a note that said only this: "The boy has sworn." The man who sent it did not smile as he sealed it. He did not know how. He did a thing because it had been written he would and because the world had put him in the chair that spoke. Ned read it and let out a breath that drew frost. He did not believe in happy endings. He believed in work done. He believed in the old gods and in snow that did not lie. He believed in bread that was paid for and men who did not take what was not theirs and girls who could run and boys who could sit and count. He believed, most of all, in the house he had carried with him into the lion's den and out again without losing it. He closed his eyes and saw it as it was. Not a keep, not a throne, not a rock, but the long, low light on snow at dusk and the smell of wood smoke and the sound of water under ice and the soft shape of children's sleep and Catelyn's hand in his and a truth carved with a knife into bleeding bark long before his father's father had thought to teach him anything. He opened his eyes and set his face to winter with the ease of a man who has learned to own his weather.